Hi everyone, today we are going to be looking at the Syrian Civil War. That'll be our topic for this week in Modern Issues. So let's get started. Some of you may already know about the Syrian Civil War. It is still happening right now. It's been going on for quite a while. It's nearly 10 years now. It starts following the 2011 Arab Spring. So the Arab Spring was this movement in the Middle East of a lot of different protesting groups that were very anti-government and were holding protests and then riots and then full uprisings and trying to overthrow the governments that were there that they considered to be oppressive regimes. And you see this starting in Tunisia was the first part, and then you see it followed suit by Syria, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, and Bahrain, all looking to overthrow these governments that limit civil liberties and rights. So in Syria, they had had a very oppressive regime for quite a long time. In 1963, the ruling family put in a state of emergency. So a state of emergency is when the government has full control over everything. An example would be several years ago when we had that very big snowstorm and President Obama put in a state of emergency to do government control over gas prices because people were starting to gouge other people. Gas was needed for survival. So that's a state of emergency, usually for a very short period of time. Today's with the coronavirus and different states putting in different lockdown measures, the individual states might have a state of emergency, but the country itself has not been put in a state of emergency, as you can see, because there are different responses in different states. But back to Syria. So in 1963, they put in the state of emergency. Again, it was supposed to be a short period of time. They did not lift it until 2011. So that is a long period of time for the government to be in full control over daily life. The current president is President Bashar al-Assad, and he is the one that the Syrian Civil War is about, the opposition to his rule. Now, he was elected in 2000, 2007, 2014. They're 7-year terms with no limit. We say elected in quotation marks because the areas that were allowed to vote were only pro-Syrian government areas, and he's receiving like 99% of the vote, which never ever happens in a fully democratic stance. Having an election doesn't make it a democracy. Communist Russia had elections during the Soviet Union, and they had like 100% turnout because you had to do it because the government told you to do it. That's not a free and fair election. So different ways that you've seen censorship and oppressiveness in the Syrian government. In 2007, you see full internet censorship, so some sites are restricted or they'll drop in and out, not allowed to use. Things like Wikipedia, basically any source of information that's not run by the Syrian government. They also made it so that any internet cafe, so a lot of people use those places to do their online searching because they don't have it in their own home. They made it a requirement that all of the logs be saved. So if you go on there to chat with your friend, that chat session is now saved and available to the Syrian government. Then in 2011, you see Ali Farzat being attacked and having his hands broken. He was a cartoonist who was anti-Assad, and while the Syrian government takes no responsibility for this. Obviously, the only person he was criticizing was the president, and then he's attacked, and his livelihood is ended. Not his life, his livelihood, which means like his job. Then in 2014, you see the introduction of ISIL into Syria, and that's when things are really going to start to shift more. ISIL attacks when countries are weak, and they see this opportunity to infiltrate, and basically your choice is to fight the terrorist group or fight the government, and they felt that they would be very successful there. With the ISIL intervention, you will see them coming on the global scale, and you'll see in 2015 Russia becoming very involved in it, where they still have troops there today defending the area. Okay. Now, what the Civil War becomes famous for on a global scale is the 2017 Khan Shaykhun attack. So this was a sarin gas attack. Now, sarin gas is extremely toxic. It works in like 10 minutes. It's outlawed in all types of war because of how horrible it is. The attack happened in a civilian area. You see 80 civilians being killed. And the responses show the very different understandings of the government and the people and the global response. So the Syrian government is condemned by the UN following an investigation. It's not like they immediately said the Syrian government did it. They do a full investigation. They find the government responsible for it, Assad in particular. And that's basically a war crime. The response from the Syrian government was to deny responsibility, which would be one standard, to say, no, it wasn't us. But then he follows up with arguments that questioning whether or not the attack even happened. Arguments like they had been killed somewhere else and then placed there to prove how to sort of show that he wasn't a good leader. Essentially what we would call fake news. So you have that response from the government, and then Russia, who is part of the UN, is going to have a separate argument because they're already involved in Syria, and they're going to argue that the attack did happen, but it was done by terrorists, not by the Syrian government. Okay. So to date, I think it's considered like the second deadliest war, with the amount of not just military but civilian casualties that have happened. And we're starting to see the U.S. involved more and more with it. So the U.S. officially becomes involved in 2015, just like Russia did, in the movement against ISIL and really pushing that terrorist group out. However, unlike Russia, who was just about the terrorist group, the U.S. Was also pushing for the removal of Assad as president, arguing that what he had done was a lot of human rights violations and he was not good for the country. In 2016, you see a change in policy where the new president, President Trump, argues that they're just going to leave Assad in power. We're not worried about him as a leader. We're just going to focus on the terrorists like Russia was doing. And unfortunately, you see the 2017 Shaykhun attack again, that being that turning point. And the U.S. will shift back to their original position of wanting to get rid of Assad. And they'll start backing Syrian opposition. Those are trying to change the government. And you will also see airstrikes. The chemical attack was on April 4th, 2017, and Trump ordered missile strikes on April 7th, 2017. So you see that quick turnover. You've also seen refugee issues becoming a major standard in the world today, with Syrian refugees fleeing to areas around, as well as further, including Europe and the United States. But you're going to learn a little bit more about that next class. So the Syrian Civil War is very complicated, very long history. There's a lot more to learn about it, but I'm not going to go overwhelming in depth. You can Google it and try and get more. It says when it comes to human rights violations, you have examples all over the board. You have examples from the Syrian government, from the Syrian opposition, from the Russians, from the U.S., from the UN. This is a war that does not care about civilians. There's no standard of protection there, which makes it that much more horrible, and that's why you see that massive refugee movement occurring as a result. So, again, you'll learn more about the refugees next class. For this class, I'm sharing an article from the BBC about that Syrian chemical attack and what they knew about it shortly after it happened. And you're just going to have one simple question to answer afterwards on the Google Doc. So that's it for today, and I will see you next class.